Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 265 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. If you've ever been told not to step in a circle of mushrooms, felt compelled to stir a pot widdershins, or wondered if the endlessly crying baby in the cradle is actually a changeling, you're probably familiar with the concept of the Otherworld. A place of supernatural encounters both incredibly good and spectacularly bad, the Otherworld featured in stories and songs throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. This was especially true on the storied Isle of Ireland. This week, I spoke with Dr. Lisa Bitel about tales from Ireland's Otherworld. Lisa is Dean's Professor of Religion and Professor of Religion and History at the University of Southern California, and the author of many books, including Land of Women, Tales of Sex and Gender from Early Ireland, and Lady of the Rock, Vision and Faith in the California Desert. Her new book is Otherworld, 9 Tales of Wonder and Romance from Medieval Ireland. Our conversation on what the Otherworld was like, why otherworldly beings were interested in humankind, and where we find the stories themselves is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Lisa, for coming on to tell us about Otherworld and all the stories from the Otherworld. It's so nice to meet you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's great to come.
So your book is collecting together Irish stories, but let's situate ourselves in time and space. You're collecting these from the entire island, and what time are we talking about?
It is a tiny island, you know. You can cross it in a car in several hours. Yes, they come from different, probably religious settlements in Ireland, in their written form at least. And people began writing them in the probably 7th or 8th century. But we have stories in language that dates from the 8th century all the way up to about 1000 or even more. And I'm working with the oldest versions I could find.
Why did you choose to work with the oldest versions?
Well, for one thing, I live in the 7th century, but for another thing, they're the most interesting to me. I mean, not because they're somehow more original or genuine, but because they're the least ornamented versions. They're more exciting than later ones.
What do you mean by ornamented?
Well, you know, later on in the Middle Ages, these stories were copied, recopied, because they were very important and also they're great stories. And, you know, as the stories aged, the people who wrote new versions of them had to explain or revise because times had changed and things were different. And their perspective on the distant past where these stories were set also changed.
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about the Middle Ages as a monolith, then you lose a lot of nuance.
Yeah. I mean, just think of King Arthur, right, who supposedly lived in, you know, the late Roman period in Britain. And by the time you get to the Central Middle Ages, he's a completely different figure than if he had lived, he would have been.
Absolutely. Okay, so when you're talking about getting these sources and pulling them together, you're talking about them being written down. So who is writing these stories down?
This is, you know, a question that people in the field, Irish history, Celticists, have been arguing about for, 150 years, sometimes viciously. The big question is, since these tales are all set in a time before Christianity came to Ireland, that is sort of the late Iron Age, were they originally oral tales that were told by professional poets? Because we know they had professional storytellers and poets. Those lasted into the modern period almost, professional poetic families. Or were these creations by authors writing, right? And the people who were writing were, by and large, if not monks, then people who lived in religious communities, which weren't quite the monasteries that, might come to mind. They were a different kind of religious settlement, but they would have been Christian religious people. And the stories are not exactly full of Christian morals or characters. So, for a long time, modern interpreters had to decide, were these stories written by monks who were clueless and just copying down oral tales? Or were they written by people consciously who, sort of fixed up some details of them? Or were they written by authors with some talent who knew the stories and wrote them to keep them forever in a manuscript?
Yes, well, it's a good question because they are, and we're going to get into some of the content in a minute, they are so different from what Christian values are meant to be. So when you're finding these, first of all, where are you finding them? And are you finding them situated in conditions that suggest that these are examples of how not to be? How are you finding them situated?
No, they're very precious, clearly. Just for being written down, they're precious. I mean, it took a whole flock of sheep to make one book. So to put in a book something besides religious texts, it really was a sign of respect for them. We find them then in the typical sort of manuscript compendia. These stories would be maybe two or three stories, and then there'd be a saint's life or genealogies of kings or a copy of some sayings of St. Patrick or something like that. Historical annals, big, big, big books. And of course, lots of those books are gone. But we find versions of these stories in several different manuscripts, which is why we're able to put some of the stories all together, because we only have fragments here and there of some of the stories. But the Irish copied and recopied stuff. They were a manuscript culture into the 18th century, partly because of the political surroundings. So we have lots of versions of them. They're not hard to find, these stories. And when the Irish became the Irish, which is to say, when the Gaelic revival movement at the end of the 19th century started to take place, and the Irish started digging up their manuscripts and finding these ancient tales that proved their heroic culture before any invaders came to the island, they went for these stories. They edited them again and again in journals and books. So, they're out there if you want to go read them in Old Irish.
Yeah, which is getting to be harder and harder to do these days. There are fewer people who can just
It's a
pick up a
horrible
book.
language. And they're also out there in other translations, but
I do want to stay with this for a second because I think that, especially in the modern world and the way that discussions swirl around the internet, there's always this idea that you were pagan or you were Christian and never the twain shall meet. So, so tell us how the other world fit into a world that was becoming increasingly Christian, even in the early part of the Middle Ages.
that's a hard question. I think about that a lot because I'm trying to write right now about the slow change from not Christian to identified as Christian among people in Ireland. How did that happen? I still don't know. But I think, as with some other tales, like you think Beowulf or Scandinavian sagas, I think these tales were part of a glorious past. The warrior culture they celebrate was something that Irish writers, however Christian they might be, looked back on and thought, I'm very proud of this. I must help preserve this.
Mm.
And I have this notion that it's also tied to the fact that they couldn't forget what came before Christianity because they lived on an island where there were these enormous monuments, burial mounds and stones and stuff that every day reminded them about their ancestors who were not Christian, but must have been amazing people to have created these things and been great warriors and, had all these adventures and so forth. So I can only think it's kind of a past. Not that they didn't also write what we think of as historical documents. They did, like chronicles of things that happened.
Mm.
But I think it had to have been pride in a sort of heritage that compelled them.
Yes. And do you get the impression reading these stories and working with these stories that these are things that people had sort of an attachment to, as in, I really hesitate to use the word superstition, but as part of their regular lives where they're like, over there, watch out for that particular burial mound because, and here's the story why. Do you
Yeah.
feel like this is part of everyday life?
I do, yeah. I do, especially because, all these tales are about what we call the other world. And she means that other reality that isn't heaven or hell, it's another reality. And it also means the places on the landscape where you can find it if you're lucky. And it means the people who live in that other reality too. And so even today, and surely in the folklore archives in Ireland that have stories from the 20th century, those places are still a little sketchy. I mean, you don't want to be caught on somewhere like Rathcrone at night by yourself. I don't want to be. It'd be terrifying. So, and there are places where farmers will warn off the archaeologists for one reason or another. Certainly will warn off the Americans. Um,
I'm sure it's still a very powerful thing. You want to be sure that you are not going to step into a fairy ring and be stuck there forever, which
Yeah.
brings me to the question. When we're looking at the other world, and especially I'm trying to look at it in the context of the time that we're talking about, so not all the layers that have been placed on it since then.
Mhm.
The other world, is it seen at this time as being always malevolent when they cross over, or sometimes benevolent? Because we have all these stories about fairies crossing over and they will do mean things to you,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah.
So how's the
Yeah.
other world viewed?
I'm trying to figure out where the bad stuff came from. I'm blaming the early modern period right now. No,
Safe.
no, yeah, the Otherworld was an amazing place. In the stories, it's better than paradise because everyone who lives there is tall and beautiful and has perfect teeth, and stuff like that. They're practically immortal. They live in these better than human kingly halls where, everything's made of precious stones and precious metals, and they dress fabulously. Their clothes are always described in detail, and they're the best fabrics, and they're embroidered and everything. And food and drink just comes to you. The rivers run with mead and ale and whatever you want, with wine even. And the weather is good all the time. It's sunny there, which I always think is the most amazing thing. Any Irish person would be thinking, yes, I must go there. So, no, it's a fabulous place. And the only thing is, if you're human, time works differently there. So if you go into the She, you never know when you're coming out. It could be at the same moment you left your own life, and it could be a century or so later, like in the story of Bron, and all your friends would be dead.
Hmm.
And so if you go there, you have to sort of give up hopes of going back to your regular life.
Yes, it's always tricky. You never know what's going to happen. So,
Mm.
if the other world is such a beautiful place, it's fabulous, everyone can get what they want there. What interest do the other world folk have in human beings at all? Why are they interested in us?
That's a great question. Nobody ever explains that in the stories. They just always seem to leave the She and appear either for some specific reason, because somebody they know is involved in a problem, or they're seeking a human partner, or they just want to come around and screw with mortal lives. I mean, it's never really clear why they bother with us. That's a good literary question that I suppose you could theorize about, for a long time.
Well, I am interested because, well, are they just, what is it? Shakespeare said, like flies to wanton boys or something. Like, why are they coming and poking at us? I know that there's a lot of romance that happens, and we should get into that in a second. But
Well, there's also, oh, sorry. There's also, in a lot of the stories, the idea is that these people in the She, some of them are descended from the Tuatha Dé, the tribes of the goddess, and there's sort of implications that these might have been deities at one time, but they're related also to people in the real world.
mhm.
So the famous hero Cuchulainn has a father who is Lugh, who might have been a god, and he lives in the that kind of thing. And I should say also there is a sort of sheen in some of the stories that suggests the She is an afterworld, the islands to the west or the land of Don, whoever he is. It's not too prominent, but it's there.
Yeah, it is kind of a murky
Yeah.
place and time, and all of these stories are intermingled, which is where I was going with this, where in literary terms, these tales are divided into sort of four categories. So what are the categories that we tend to sort these things into when we must?
Well, that's modern category, As I say, the early Irish themselves didn't use those ones. They used different ones. But they talk about, the modern commentators talk about cycles of tales. So there are historical tales about kings. I just know as I say these, I'm going to forget one. Historical cycles about kings. There's the Ulster cycle, so-called, because it focuses on the big main national epic, what has come to be called the Táin Bó Cúailnge of the Cattle Raid of Cooley, which is one story with loads of stories as sort of satellites to it. There's the mythological cycle, which has to do with the Tuatha Dé that I just said. And what am I forgetting as the fourth cycle? Fenian cycle!
That's it.
Yes, the stories about Finn McCool, yeah, who is a mercenary, sort of, the Fian band. They live in the woods and hunt and fight.
Right. But the Irish back in the day are not categorizing them in this way. How are they categorizing them?
Oh, we have a couple of documents from like, I don't know, 900 or so that are called tale lists. And the idea was a professional storyteller, an oral teller of tales, should know about 300 stories and a couple in each category. And so they listed the categories, and there are things like destruction tales, elopement tales, cattle raid tales, king tales, of course, abduction tales, fiery devastation tales, things like that. And there are about, I don't know, 20 or so, maybe more types of tales that they distinguished.
Well, this makes sense in a professional context because a professional is going to be showing up to an event and going, "What should I tell? It's a wedding. What story should I tell?"
Yeah, yeah. What
Maybe
do you
not
want? You want an elopement? I'll give you an elopement.
yeah. Maybe today is not the day for the, adultery tales I could be
Yeah,
telling
right. That's exactly right.
Okay,
It was
so
a mnemonic thing, obviously, partly to, oh, I have to know a flood and I have to know an abduction.
yeah. Okay, so one of the things that you mentioned, I think, is so important and also a bit of a lament in your introduction is that when we're looking at stories this old, we're missing a lot of context and we're definitely missing the jokes. So, how often do you feel when you're translating these or bringing them forward that you're missing a joke? That this should be funny and you just can't get it.
All the time, I think about when I first started learning Old Irish in college, I remember just a silly mistranslation I did in front of the whole seminar,
Mm.
and it reminds me now that when I read a story still, there's something that I just can't understand. Like, why did that happen now in this tale? Why did
Mm.
it end that way? What else is going on here? And at first I thought, it's just the distance between me and them, and I'm never going to know. And then as I read the stories again and again and read more and more about them, I began to see it's a reference to something people knew. It's a reference to something that people would have found funny or that would make them feel, bereft or something like that. And so, I mean, I've been in the field for like 40 years. So I've got some of them, and I hope I've got enough of those insights then to make these stories more approachable to
Mhm.
folks who haven't been living in the seventh or eighth century.
That's the trick, right? Because often when people talk about saints, we talk about them as being almost the superheroes of the Middle Ages, and you can recognize them by their symbols, right? Like there's a wheel,
Hmm.
we know it's Catherine. And this is very much the same in these
Hmm.
folk tales, right? So tell us about how that works. What are some of the symbols, for example, that you know that you're talking about a certain person?
Yeah.
They show up and they're wearing
Yeah,
something, or
yeah. And they're not symbols so much, but for example, if you see a striding towards you in your fort, you see a tall, very good-looking blonde man wearing a cloak of green, and it's a nice one. You know he's probably from the other world because, first of all, tall, blonde, perfect, but also green was a color they wore in the other world. Their cloaks were often green, and you see it throughout the stories. So there are tips like that that people would have known. And then also sometimes, as I say in the intro, there will be characters who make little appearances in one tale and are the heroes of another tale. And if you're in the story, you're here in the story where they make a sort of cameo, you're like, aha, I understand why he came into the story because he's related to that guy and he did that thing in that other story, that kind of thing. Or when it's secretly somebody who's a hero who appears not heroic in a story, you could say, ha ha ha, I know who he is. He could take the place. So it's stuff like that, really. And then also, the stuff that we don't get is just the day-to-day stuff that made the stories real.
yes, that's the difficult stuff to access, the stuff that
Mhm.
is all about the textures and the weather and all of that stuff that you
Yeah.
just
Or
don't
just what the
know.
house looks like, why that
Mhm.
happened.
Exactly. So, as you're trying to recreate these nine tales, what did you have to do to try and figure out how to add this stuff in? Did you decide, "Well, I'm not going to do footnotes"? How did you decide to deal with all of
Yeah.
these sort of contextual clues?
It was a hard one. I started out this project because I was in Oxford for a year with my husband and I was between projects. And he said, why don't you just translate some stuff? You'll probably get a contract. I was like, okay, I'll give it a shot. And then I started translating and I realized, okay, I'm not the top philologist among people who know Old Irish. I mean, there are people who are far better translators than I am. But I also realized people aren't going to like these unless they know these little tips that I know. And so it became more than a translation. It became, as the editors insisted on calling it, a retelling.
Hmm.
Although I think all retellings are translations, but and so I wanted to explain to people not just the jokes in the background, what the house looked like, but I wanted to help them understand what the writers of these tales were trying to say, too. And also what the writers of these tales weren't trying to say, but that was obvious to modern people. So, one big theme in the stories, as it turns out accidentally, was the perspective of women and what was happening during all the pages when, say, a heroine wasn't present or wasn't saying a word for pages, why? And to connect that with the other stories so people could begin to get a sort of trans-story picture of
Hmm.
life in Ireland in a certain period.
Yeah. And I just want to pause here for a moment for all the people who are listening and working on their careers and stuff. You don't have to be the best translator to bring something very important to the field. You can just bring your talents, the way that you tell things. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that because it's such an important part of the work is bringing your own self, your own talent to it.
Well, you don't know how vicious Celticis can be, actually.
I do not. You're right. You're right.
Yeah. No, I mean, especially, when you're translating something in a native language, it's not in Latin, everybody's language, right? And when you don't grow up as a speaker of that language, there is always sort of a territory, a boundary,
Hmm.
that you're crossing. But to retell stories, I think, how many times have people retold Cinderella, right? So, so you're right. We all do have a sort of access to these and fair play. We can all try to translate them for the modern period.
Yes. So you tried to bring forth, or you did bring forth, retold 9 stories. What made you choose these 9 out of the 300 that you know as a professional storyteller?
Too bad I forgot those other 200 and however. No, I wanted stories that were blatantly about the other world because that's what I want to understand. And then it struck me that a lot of them are about people from the two different worlds making a connection. And in this case, the ones I collected, they fall in love or they have sex or they get married or they try to, but they can't. But it is about affection across the boundaries, which is something that is reminiscent of more modern folk tales, even the folk tales of like a bride abducted from her wedding and then in the real world, she seems to die, but she was probably taken into the she, that kind
Hmm.
of thing. There's some sort of hint of erotic or love connection throughout fairy tales. So that's what I
Hmm.
want to think about.
Which is a little bit different from Cinderella, even though it's the
A
subtext there.
little. Yeah. Probably not the original Cinderella.
Right. So, where do you start your own cycle of stories? Where do you start it? And why did you choose to start there?
I began with the oldest of stories we know that has this connection in it. And it seems like a very straightforward story of a young prince being sort of seduced by an otherworldly woman. A very short story. And his father and his father's druid are all upset about this because this young person that they can't see has sort of taken over the son's mind. He's ill with lovesickness. And it ends with him going off with this woman in a crystal boat, I think, to the other world. And it's also interesting because the recent take on this story is that it's a straight Christian allegory of a Christian or would-be Christian who realizes that the life beyond this one is far better than the mortal life and is going off to where there's only light and goodness. And I don't know, the question that comes to my mind is why would you write a story about saving your soul in these terms?
Hmm.
Is it because the package is so important it can be used to make other kinds of messages, or is it just some monk thinking he's clever putting this allegorical tale in these terms? I don't think so. It's too elaborate a framework. But I thought it was interesting, at least to introduce the idea that there could be more than one message going on in what seemed like fairy tales sometimes.
Yeah, this is the type of thing that it seems like in later centuries monks would say, and this is, and they would explain it to you so that you
Hmm.
didn't miss that Christian context if it was there. And maybe they just didn't feel the need to mention it because you could, like so many other things, you can read this in different ways. And why not?
Yeah. And there are more blatant tales that come later on. There's one I didn't put in here that's pretty interesting about a monk who takes as a foster child a young woman of the Shi who wants to be a Christian. And all the fabulous relations of hers come and try to get her to go back to the other world, but she won't. And of course,
Hmm.
she dies young and pure. You know. So, I mean, there are tales out there where they work this out to its final conclusion, the Christianity otherworld tension.
Hmm.
But the fact that the other world represents the opposite of Christianity is pretty interesting too.
Yes. And one of the things that I noticed reading the tales is that there are lots of tricks, there are lots of ways in which otherworld people from the She are acting in ways that are immoral. Do you think that the audiences listening to this are supposed to take something from that? Like, I should also wheel and deal in ways that are not straightforward. What do you think people are taking from this? Is this
That's another
something?
excellent question. Yeah. I mean, that sort of goes back to the big question of who are the stories for? If they were still told over and again, are they for a different audience than the written versions? And I do think so, yeah. But I think that the lessons are tucked in there sometimes if you want to read them. And by and large, these are just really good stories about the past.
That's always why I am interested in stories. My special interest, of course, is Arthurian stories, but they're just really good
Mhm.
stories. That's why I want to
Yeah,
read them.
some better than others, but yeah, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting question to ask, not just about making deals and promises to people, because there's always tricks about promises. You have to be
Mhm.
careful what you wish for. But also, you mentioned a through line is that things are happening to women, by women. They're not always good. And so, you wonder, these women in the audience, as well as men in the audience, what are they supposed to be thinking about this? Are the rules different for the She? Are they supposed to
Mhm.
be different?
There are two stories that sort of bring different opinions about that to the listener, the reader is, there's this one story about this woman named Becula, whose name means little value. And she comes and seduces a king and they get married. And then she wants to go sleep with his foster son. And then she finds what is clearly an otherworldly warrior and ends up going off with him. And what kind of moral story is that? The king remains at home saying, with a cloak over his head, saying, oh, I need to go to mass and my wife has left me and she's clearly a bad person. And she goes off and has a happy life, presumably with this guy from the other world. Then there's the last tale in which Cuchulainn, the hero, and his wife Ever have a big quarrel because Cuchulainn has found an otherworldly woman that he trysts with. He takes her as a mistress or whatever. They have a liaison. And Ever comes with her women band to try to attack this lovely otherworldly woman. And she makes a beautiful poem to Cuchulainn about, of course, everything that's new is glittery and better to you than what's old and trusted. So, I mean, it's not just that women are always oppressed. Their voices pop up in these things sometimes. And you have to read the voices against the silences, really, to know what was being thought about in terms of being a woman, how a woman should behave.
And it's not a simple thing to pull out or parse. And I appreciate that in your book you didn't try and simplify it for
Yeah,
us.
God, no.
Yeah, you bring up one thing that a couple of times, the fact that there are foster children, there are foster parents in this. And this is something that seems to be pretty common in the tales. So this relationship between fostering, something that happens quite a lot. Do you find that this is something that is reflected or would have been reflected in Irish society, or is this something that is
Oh,
just
yeah. Yeah,
something
yeah.
to, yeah.
No, we find there's a vast corpus of secular laws from Ireland that are some of them as early as the 7th century, maybe. And fosterage was an institution in Ireland and also in Scotland. The idea was you sent your kid away, and this would probably have been only the elites, I guess, to another household, maybe someone related to you, maybe a maternal relative, for example. And that child grew up with the foster parents learning to be an adult. So if you were a noble boy, you would learn to be a warrior and an administrator of some sort, a king or somebody who ran land, a landlord and had soldiers and so forth. And you would learn your skills. A woman would go, and if she were a noble woman, she'd learn embroidery and how to manage a household and, deal with stuff. And the idea was not only that you were learning these skills elsewhere, but especially if you were a young man, fosterage gave you another set of relations to rely on when you were battling your brothers for whatever there was of the inheritance, whether it was a farm or a kingdom. And for women too, it was your foster father was someone you could call upon, in times of need. If your family and your husband's family were treating you poorly, you had another set. Because political life in Ireland was just feuding all the time.
Yes.
Well, it's a dangerous place.
It feels like some of the ways in which modern people look back on the Middle Ages, the fostering thing is very confusing, I think, to some people. And so it's interesting to see how these bonds come up, where the fostering bond can be strong or like stronger sometimes than the familial bond. And I think seeing it come out in like these relationships with the she, I was wondering if this is something that translates over as something we want to emulate or don't want to emulate.
Yeah.
I keep coming back to this,
but your kid to boarding school or something. I don't know. Maybe you don't get that close with your teacher in boarding school. I wouldn't know. But no, I don't know. I think it's a safety net for a society that didn't know how to divide its wealth and power in any peaceful way.
Yeah.
No, I just said that like very neatly, and I've never said that before. I should put that down.
You can listen back to the recording and quote yourself.
Yeah, I'll take notes.
That was awesome. I love that.
Yeah, but where does it appear outside? I mean, there's kids sent out to apprentice in other societies. I can't think where was fosterage strong elsewhere.
Fosterage, I mean, in terms of the chivalric culture, you find it elsewhere in the Middle Ages, right? But I guess I'm thinking of it because it's so familiar to these Irish stories. When people are talking about this kind of relationship in Arthurian stories later, it doesn't seem to be the same sort of kinship as much. It seems more like friendship than kinship. Maybe that's kind of where I'm going with that. Yeah.
But a hierarchical friendship with a knowledgeable person and a young knight.
Yeah. This is when we were just nerding out amongst ourselves.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. I think that's half the reason people come to this podcast. But bringing it back
nerds
to
at play.
Yeah, I mean, this is what the people want to hear. Bringing it back to your book. So I'm sure that you had a tough decision in deciding to bring these 9 tales together. Do you have a favorite that you added in? And then do you have a favorite that you had to leave out?
I have loads of favorites that I left out, like the one I was telling you about the young woman who leaves the she. No, my favorite one, and the one that started the whole collection, I think, is the wooing of Aideen, because it's a most peculiar story, and it might be 3 stories, and it might be 1 story. It's 2 lovers who cross centuries and incarnations and end up together, which is very satisfying in medieval literature, as you know, because it don't happen that way so often, And also the characters themselves change over the story. And when I first started reading this story, I didn't grasp that change. And then I came to see how intricate a story it really is. It's a fabulous tale.
I mean, you do want things to work out for people because it doesn't usually.
Yeah, in the Middle Ages, it doesn't all that. People think the princess always gets rescued by the knight, but no.
Oh, not usually. Not usually. So what were some of the ones that you left out? Because you're getting interviewed all sorts of places. So give us the goods. What are some of the ones that you had to leave out?
Well, there are other courtship tales, actually, that are probably less well known than some of these. And there's another great tale, but it's sort of later in the Middle Ages, about a poet who has to go and capture a sort of wild girl warrior and civilize her over some days till she comes back to herself, There are all sorts there's other stories from the time. There's a really famous one that ended up being taken up by the Irish revivalists, the Deirdre of the Sorrows. I mean, the original tale is the exile of the sons of Ushlu, a tale about a woman who runs away from her husband and runs off with a young warrior, and they have to go into exile in Scotland and act as mercenaries, but it gets dangerous because she's so attractive, and they come home again and they're set up and her lover gets killed. And the poetry in that story is desperately sad and really beautiful. I
Hmm.
remember one of my professors, who was sort of the chief druid of Irish studies, back in the day, saying this was his favorite story, and it was so beautiful it made him cry every time. So there are tons of tales out there that, who knows, maybe if this goes well, we'll see.
Part two.
Yeah.
So I don't want to give away the tales because I want people to read the
Mm.
stories and get to know them. Do you have a favorite character that appears more than once over
More
these
than one.
cycles? Do you have one? Like, is
Ooh,
there
that's
some
tough.
like a time that somebody shows
Yeah.
up and you're like, yes, it's them. They're
Yeah, yeah,
back.
yeah. No, no, no. I love the McOg, the young one, Angus the McOg. And in later days, again in the 19th century, he was sort of touted as the Irish god of love. And he turns up in tons of tales that aren't in here as well. But he starts out as the foster son of the one who's truly my favorite character, but he's just in one story, Mither. And he's a precocious warrior, and he's the son of the Tuatha Dé, people from the Tuatha Dé. In one story, he's sort of just a foster son helper to the what turns out to be the hero of the tale. But in another story, he's not named as a supernatural figure, and nor are the other characters in the story. But he is another one who's lying in bed at night, and a young woman comes into his bedroom and starts singing to him, and it's like, "Whoa, come on, honey!" And he tries to grab her, and he can't, and ends up being falls in love with her, and he can't have her, and he's sick of love for a year, and he's going to die. And they have to figure out how to help him find the woman so he can get well again. So he's a sort of like almost comic character sometimes, but he's also a great warrior and lover and so forth. And the thing is, a lot of these heroes who turn up in other stories, they have other lovers and other adventures, and maybe they get killed, but the poet will have to say, well, no, in this story, he really doesn't get killed. That's a different story, a different version. So Angus is one of those. He's everywhere.
Yes, and he is in this book. So people who are interested in checking that out, you can see his early story in this book. Okay, so one of the things that you mentioned that I think is important as we begin to wrap this up is that you mentioned that when people are looking at the other world in later centuries, closer to our century, maybe in our century, everything is smaller. So when you're having people who are encountering the other world in a medieval context, what do you want to tell them about it? What's different? What's
You know,
great?
I think that the people in Ireland in the Middle Ages had a much easier version of how worlds could merge together. And maybe that was a product of Christianity in a way. You were always conscious of, if you were a devout Christian, of the heaven that awaited and how saints could come and go from heaven to the world and back. Death was no problem. But also in the sheet, it's easier to think of people moving across a boundary that you really couldn't see at first. There's one story where a guy just wanders into the other world on Samhain, on Halloween. And I think people were easier about thinking also about the overlap of Christian thinking, storytelling thinking, the landscape and stories about it thinking. Those things could blend together in a way that people didn't have to differentiate as clearly as we try to make them.
Mm,
It's like you said before, it's not that they were Christian or pagan, so to speak, not Christian. They could be all those things, and
hmm.
a different amount of them on any given day. So,
Yeah. I think that's a really good way to look at it in that we really feel the need to compartmentalize today. And this is
mm,
just not necessary in a lot of medieval contexts, and this one, the storytelling being one of them. So for people who are interested in following this themselves, say they want to pursue a career and they want to study Celtic myth or the other world, where would you tell them to start? Where should they start digging in? Start with this book.
learn Old Irish. Learn Old Irish. Seriously. I mean, I learned new things about these tales. It didn't end up being a straight translation, but I translated every story. And just a single word would sometimes clue me into exactly what was going on. It's difficult I'm sure you know, to appreciate any literature if you can't read it in the original,
Mhm.
which is what has kept people away from these tales, obviously, and it's a shame.
Mhm.
But failing that, there are lots of good books about this literature that sort of help you understand how they were written and stuff like that. It's a fabulous one by Mark Williams and help you understand that these are stories. They aren't necessarily, the pagan myths of the ancestors, and they aren't necessarily, something that was passed from family to family for a million years. There's stories that somebody wrote at a certain time in a certain context that
Mhm.
then got recopied and so forth. And so there are books out there about that help people. There's a little bibliography at the back of the book that helps people start out
Excellent.
learning about the stories.
Excellent. Because as I've talked about on this podcast forever, but especially in the last couple of months, it's okay to bring your love to something because that is some of the best way to access it.
True that, true that. And people should read these stories. I mean, that's how I got interested in them, is I read one and I didn't understand it. It's like, ooh, I got to figure this out.
I need to learn more. Well, thank you, Lisa, for coming on and introducing us to the other world. I hope that other people will go on to read the whole book in the Nine Tales and
And
get
buy
as
it.
hooked on it.
Yeah,
Yes.
buy it. You can buy it. It's on Amazon.
Yes, it is available. And I will make sure that people get the whole title,
Attach
links
link.
to your work and all that. Don't worry. Don't worry. I got you. Thanks, Lisa.
Great. This was a pleasure. Thanks.
To find out more about Lisa's work, you can visit her website at lisabitel-imawriter.com. Her new book is Otherworld, 9 Tales of Wonder and Romance from Medieval Ireland. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey. So with elections being all the talk these days, I decided to look for some medieval democracy in action.
All right.
Not the easiest to find, but I did come across the Fables of Otto of Cheriton. It's a great 13th century collection of tales, and he gives us some stories about elections held by trees, ants, frogs, and chicks.
Nice.
That's right. In most cases, the elections don't go very well. I don't know why frogs selected a serpent, but it happened. And Otto gives us some nice little morals about not thinking through your choices.
Well, I think that you need to be responsible when you're electing people, and thinking about your choices beforehand is probably a good idea.
Indeed, because even the ants come to regret it later.
Yeah, well.
So we've got that. Plus, I've just launched a new online course on the First Crusade.
That's awesome. What is in it?
So it's me talking about this kind of sources and studies of the First Crusade. And you know how much I love talking about primary sources. So
I do, yeah.
The First Crusade is great because there's like a dozen accounts that came out within the first few years after the First Crusade. So it's a lot of fun to kind of go through them. And I love how there's one called Deeds of the Franks. And because it's written by a soldier, everyone else wants to rewrite it to make it better. He's too uncouth, so no, we have to make it great. I love the rewriting of monks, how they want to change things up. And of course, you recently did with Thomas K. Smith about letters in the First Crusade.
Mm-hmm.
I talk a bit about that as well, and how important that book is going to be for Crusade scholars.
Yeah, it's going to be a big change to how we look at the First Crusade. So people who sign up for your course, they can do this sort of on their own and learn all about the sources that tell us about the First Crusade.
Yeah, this is a self-paced course. So you get 5 lectures from me, plus some handouts and some other materials. And my always hope is to give you tools you need to begin your studies of it. Like if you want to really deep dive into this history and what happened, what do I need to grab onto? I love talking about this. So hopefully there'll be more of these Crusade stuff. Fortunately, there was a lot of Crusades for me to cover.
I don't know that fortunately is the right word, but there certainly were a lot of Crusades for you to cover.
Yes. So we're starting out with First Crusade. So check it out on medievalstudies.thinkific.com.
Nice.
All right. Besides that, we've got a few other kind of fun pieces. We have one about being right or left-handed and how it relates to the Mary Rose ship.
Yeah, so the Mary Rose is actually a Tudor ship that sunk and tells us all sorts of stuff about medieval archery. That's really what I'm interested in when it comes to the Mary Rose. But it's telling us about right-handed and left-handedness.
Yeah, because the assumption is that the entire crew had to be right-handed because being left-handed at this time is looked down upon. So some researchers checked out their collarbones to see what kind of effect making sure that everyone is right-handed have on their collarbones. And there is some changes. So this applies to you and me too.
Our skeletons?
Yeah, our skeletal structure.
Well, I hope that people do wait 500 years before they start looking at my skeleton. I'm using it right now.
Well, you won't need it in 50 years, right?
Well, we'll see. We'll see.
Okay, we'll see. So we have that. Plus, we have 5 ways that pigs influenced medieval warfare and politics.
Pigs. I love pigs. At least I love medieval pigs. Jamie Kreiner on talking about medieval pigs, and that was such a fun book. So now this is all about pigs and warfare?
Yeah, it's just how they show up in warfare and show up in kind of key moments of politics. Not everyone survives their encounter with a pig.
It's true. Pigs are a lot more dangerous than people think.
All that and much, much more on medievalist.net.
Well, thank you, Peter, for stopping by and telling us all of the stuff that is on medievalist.net. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you to each and every one of you who supports this podcast through letting the ads play through, spreading the word, proudly wearing a 5-minute medievalist shirt from tpublic.com, or signing up at patreon.com. I literally could not do this without you, so you have my eternal gratitude. If you'd like to become a patron to help me keep the awesome medieval content coming, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from the she to fleas, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.